Good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Jimenez. Welcome to our webinar. We're so excited to have a conversation with someone that I've known for quite a long time and who has been a very important individual in my life personally, but also professionally. Someone who's been very important to me, but very, very important for New Mexico Voices for Children. New Mexico Voices for Children is over a 30-year-old child advocacy organization that is focused on just what the name says, on being a voice for children, primarily with the state legislature, but also at the federal level and some at the local level. So we have a board of directors. Fred, to our great benefit, has been one of those members of our board of directors for several years and is back again after having already served several years on the board. And so we're so grateful to have him on our board. Now, before we get started, of course, we have to take care of some technical details. First of all, I need to thank the people that were really responsible for this. And first and foremost is my colleague and our deputy director, Amber Wallin. It was her idea after hearing Fred speak on another venue about the Kerner Commission to have this conversation. So thank you, Amber. She will be a co-host. Second, Brian Urban, who is handling all of the technical details. Farah Council, who you may see a little bit later on, providing us questions. Sharon Kane and Marie-Pierre Fergan, who've been really terrific in doing the communications work on this. So before we get started, let's talk about a couple things. One, we intend this to be interactive, so there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can submit a question. Farah will be monitoring those questions and we will get to them as we can. Now, only the panelists will be able to see the questions, but we'll be able to work your questions in through the course of our discussions with Senator Harris. We ask you not to use the chat function. We won't be monitoring that for the questions, so make sure that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now, this event is free for anyone to join, but may invite people who might try and be a little disruptive. We don't expect that to happen, but we'll be monitoring the chat room for that and take down anything that might be offensive. And we caution you not to click on any links that might appear in there unless directed to by one of us. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to view on the Voices website after the event. Amber, did I miss anything on the technical details?
Nope.
We're good to go? All right, now to the main event. Senator Fred Harris was born in a two-room farmhouse in Walters, Oklahoma in 1930. After graduating from the University of Oklahoma's College of Law, he began his public service in the Oklahoma State Senate. He served Oklahoma in the U.S. Senate from 1964 to 1973. And after leaving office, he came to New Mexico to teach at UNM. In the political science department. He is an award-winning author of several novels and nonfiction books. And I really encourage you to take a look at those books. I really love the fictional accounts of life in Oklahoma that Fred has written. We've been very fortunate to have him serve on our board of directors for many years. And Fred, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today to talk about some incredible work that really resonates today, but actually took place many, many years ago. Amber?
Hi, Fred. Thanks so much for joining us here and welcome to all of those tuning in. So, as we know, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, commonly known as the Kerner Commission, was created and appointed by President Lyndon B. Johnson almost exactly 53 years ago in the summer of 1967. And it was tasked with finding the truth, as LBJ said, about the racial tensions and social unrest that were escalating across the nation. And we're going to talk more about the commission and about its findings and recommendations and your experiences serving as a young senator on it. But before we get into that, I wondered if we could hear more about you, and I'll share with those listening that Fred was 20 years ago a professor of mine in the poli-sci department at UNM as a young freshman college student. And I really distinctly remember, Fred, your stories about policy and politics and your experiences as a senator and a presidential candidate. But your path to getting there, though, is a bit of an unexpected one and a noteworthy one. And so just to kick us off, can you tell us a little bit more about your journey from the tiny town of Walters, Oklahoma, to really a whole lifetime spent of fighting for social justice that led you to serve on the Kerner Commission?
Well, I got into politics and into policy when I was at the University of Oklahoma, and in graduate school first, and then in law school. There was a group of veterans, law students, who, I don't know, sort of adopted me in an organization that they recruited called the Congress Club, and they got me involved in politics very early, backing candidates. For example, Congressman Wallin from Oklahoma City, who was elected to the Senate, and later on was my colleague in the United States Senate. Mike was one of those senators early who were opposed to the red-baiting demagogue Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. And I was head of the Young Democrats in Oklahoma, and we went on record at the University of Oklahoma condemning McCarthy and his tactics, which won me the first opposition editorial I ever had from the Daily Oklahoman. They said if I was any indication of what young people were like today, the country was in a lot of trouble. Well, I went off to Lawton to practice law, and I promised a group I went in with at first to practice law that I wasn't going to get into politics. I was married, I had a child, I wanted to make a living. But as it turned out, the state senator came down tragically with a brain tumor, and I actually was more or less dragooned into running for the state senate, 25, as young as you could be, and serving the Senate, and a year and a half out of law school. And I was elected and served in the Oklahoma State Senate 8 years. And then I was very interested in running for governor. That's what I had in mind. But the United States Senator from Oklahoma, Robert S. Kerr, Time magazine had called the most powerful member of the Senate about that time, died. And it was sort of like the situation had been with the state Senate. People didn't like either one of the two main candidates. Otherwise, the governor appointed himself to the vacant position, and I then was elected to it at age 33. I went to the United States Senate with, I used to say, with all of the expertise in foreign policy and economic policy that 8 years in the Oklahoma State Senate affords one. And I had to learn fast. I went on the Senate Finance Committee very early, the most powerful committee in the Senate, dealing with taxes, trade, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, so many other matters. And I got very much involved, as I had already been in Lawton, with civil rights. And I should say about the Kerner report, during those riots, occurred in the summer of '67, in over 25 cities in the country. The worst were in Newark and Detroit. Enormous loss of life, most of it black life, and most of those were innocent, really, with overreaction by the untrained police, untrained in riots, and the National Guard in some cases. And in the two worst disorders and violent protests in Detroit and Newark, they weren't quelled until President Johnson called out the army with the agreement of the local governors. Well, during the height of the Newark riot, I went to the Senate floor and grabbed up one of my seatmates, Walter Mondale, later Vice President. My other seatmate was Robert Kennedy. and we were the three of us were the closest friends in the Senate. I got him to co-author a resolution to create a blue ribbon citizens commission, not only to look at the law and order aspects of these riots, which were really alarming and terrible, but also to get at deeper causes, as the resolution said, of the riots, and to make recommendations for getting at the solutions to those causes. I held hearings in my own subcommittee on that resolution. I had Whitney Young, head then of the Urban League, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was not then a senator, as witnesses. And then it occurred to me that President Lyndon Johnson, create this commission on his own by executive order without waiting for action by Congress. So I got in touch with Doug Gator in his office, and Gator had me write a letter to Johnson for that. And it wasn't very long thereafter it was announced that the president was going to appoint what became the Kerner Commission. He called me just in advance of doing it and said, "I'm going to put you on it." And that's how the commission was formed by executive order, and that's how I came to be a member of it. I had already been involved with Robert Kennedy on the Ribbikoff Committee on Urban Problems hearings, and with Robert Kennedy again, I was on the McClellan Committee, the Permanent Investigating Subcommittee, which was the old Joseph McCarthy Committee, and we were looking into these disorders, but primarily McClellan's, our chair's viewpoint was that we ought to do something primarily about law and order. He wasn't too interested in deeper causes. So I think that and the fact that I had authored the resolution to create the commission caused President Johnson to put me on it.
And Fred, you know, I've heard you tell a story about kind of the moment that you found out that you were going to be on the Kerner Commission, and I think it provides an interesting window into what President Johnson thought he might be getting out of the commission. You know, who he thought he was putting on there and how he thought that, you know, would kind of determine the outcome. Can you share a little bit more about maybe some of those things he said to you when, as he was letting you know that you'd be on the commission?
Yes, it had been announced that that Johnson was going to have this state national broadcast and appoint what became the Kerner Commission. So we brought a television set into our living room there where we lived, and had some neighbors and friends over, including James Jimenez's late mother-in-law, Margaret Gover, who worked for Americans for Limited Opportunity, which my then wife, Margaret Elliston, actually, Donna Harris had, my wives mixed up here, had formed. And so we were all sitting around waiting for Johnson to come on the air. And my youngest daughter, Laura, who was then, I think, about in the 3rd grade, she came running out of the kitchens where we had wall telephone, and she said, President Johnson, Daddy President Johnson is on the phone for you. Well, that caused a little stir there in the living room, as you might imagine. And I went into the kitchen and picked up the phone, standing at attention. And I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." And he said, "Fred, I hope you're going to watch television." I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "I'm going to appoint that commission." Actually, he said, "I'm going to appoint that damn commission you've been talking about." And I said, "Well, I think that's a good idea." He said, "I'm going to put you on it." I said, I hadn't, this is word for word. I said, I didn't expect that, but I'll do the best I can. I could. He said, and Fred, he said, "Don't you be like some of your colleagues. I point them to things and they don't show up." I said, "I'll show up." He said, and another thing, Fred, I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." He said, "I want you to remember that you're a Johnson man." I said, "I am a Johnson man." He said, "If you forget it, I'll take my pocket knife and cut your blank off." He did not say blank. I went back into the living room, and my friends and neighbors there said, "What did he say?" I said, "Well, some of it was kind of personal." Unfortunately, our report, which shocked the conscience of the nation, also was very disturbing to President Johnson. I think he thought with what we recommended in our findings that we'd gone too far, and that I had forgotten that I was a Johnson man.
Fred, before we move on to talk about the commission a little bit more, could you just say a little bit about what do you think it was in your background, in your history and growing up in Oklahoma, in that area around Lawton is not a wealthy area. What do you think it was that kind of inspired you to become a champion for civil rights and social justice in a way that has really made such a huge difference in so many people's lives?
Well, I've pondered that. I don't know exactly. It's sort of a mystery how we come to have our beliefs. I think one thing was growing up with the Comanche Indians. There are no reservations as such in New Mexico. I mean, in Oklahoma, like there is in New Mexico. There, the reservation, which had been first created, was broken up and checkerboarded. Comanche Indians chose 160 acres, and then the rest was open to white settlement. So they lived all around us in Walters. I don't think any lived in Walters, a little town of about 1,500 Comanche Indian people. And I went to school with Comanche Indian kids, of course. And I think that made a difference. Also, here's a kind of funny thing. When I was 3, during the Dust Bowl and the Depression, the Great Depression, my parents did not have a home. And for a time we moved in with a Comanche Indian family, George and Mabel Kusiloon, if their name is pronounced correctly, Kusiloon, I think it means looking for the buffalo. Anyway, they had a house. And so we moved in with them and lived with them for a while. I think, that was very unusual, I thought, then, because there was a great deal of discrimination against Indians. And I later, of course, married a Comanche Indian, LaDonna Harris. And I'm sure that's the first time that was true in our home county. But also, I should say about Walters, a little town, no black people lived there. I think earlier there had been an ordinance that prohibited black people from even spending the night in Walters. So I didn't come in contact. Well, I'd seen some black people down at the neighboring town of Temple, very briefly, but never to talk to. The first time I ever actually had real contact with a black person, and certainly the first time I ever shook hands with a black person, was when I was 12 years old. I went on a train with a great aunt down to Decatur, Mississippi, just east of Jackson, where my dad came from. And I stayed a month with relatives there in a great old house, which was a symbol of, it was kind of run down by then, but it was a symbol of earlier, better days, the Harris clan. And one day, the owner of that house, who was some kind of cousin of mine, little George Carey, his dad was called Big George, and I were walking on the dirt road into downtown Decatur. I'm 12 years old. And we came to a railroad crossing. And he said to me, hold on a minute, I want you to meet this old man coming along on the track. And there's a ragged old black man, gray-haired, straw-hatted. And he hollered at him saying something like, Uncle Charlie, called him Uncle. Uncle Charlie, come over here, I want you to meet somebody. And the old man slowly came over. And he said, I want you to meet Cliff Harris's, well, I should say this, before he called him over, he said to me, this old man was your grandpa's N-word. And he called him over and he said, I want you to meet Cliff Harris's grandson. And the old man took off his hat. I'm 12 years old. And he said, I don't mean anything by it, but I'd like to shake hands with Mr. Cliff's grandbaby. Well, I knew right then there's something wrong with that picture. And later on in school, I took to heart, a lot of my friends and family did not, but I took to heart as we learned by heart the words of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and the Gettysburg Address especially, our nation is conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And I remember that in high school, I took a speech class one semester, and we had to recite some item of our choosing from Shakespeare. And I chose the Shylock's speech from The Merchant of Venice. But we had no Jews in Walters. And I didn't know anything about the terrible anti-Semitism and the awful mistreatment of Jews. So I changed the word Jew to Negro, as we said then, and where Shylock says, if you prick a Negro, won't he bleed? So how I came to those views is a kind of a mystery, but I think part of it was growing up with Comanche Indians.
Thanks for sharing that, Fred. I think it's such an interesting window as we think about how our stories influence where we end up and what we do. And it's interesting, I guess I think we're 11 members on the commission, and there was, I guess, maybe 10 Johnson men and 1 Johnson woman. And out of the Johnson men, there were 2 Black men. And so as you all went out on about your work, overwhelmingly white men who maybe hadn't experienced racial injustice directly, most of you. What did your work look like? What did the work of the commission look like? And how did that influence the eventual outcomes of what you found?
We started off with hearings, about 20 days of hearings, where we heard from everybody from J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And then we divided in, first of all, we had the terrific executive director who Johnson chose, I'm sure, because he was a Johnson man. But he, like the rest of us, told the truth, decided to tell the truth. And he put together a terrific staff and put out contracts for a great many serious studies. We sent our staff out on field trips to all of these major cities where the riots had occurred. They did countless surveys and interviews and so forth. And then we divided, the commission members divided into teams. John Lindsay and I were a team. It's strange but true. We hit it off at once. We had terribly different backgrounds, but we found we were exactly on the same page about what the situation was and what ought to be done. And so, for example, in these teams, we went out to riot cities. John and I were a team, John Lindsay. And I remember, for example, we went to Newark, not to Newark, but to Milwaukee. We also went to Cincinnati. For example, in Milwaukee, as I started to say, Milwaukee very segregated up on the north side of that city. And I spent about a half a day there while I was there, sitting in a black barbershop, talking to these young men, most of them recently having moved from the South to Milwaukee. There'd been a great post-war surge of Black people from the South into these northern cities. And the first question that I asked these young men puzzled them. They didn't know how to answer. And I finally figured out the reason why. The question I asked them was, do you find more discrimination against African-Americans here in Milwaukee or in where you came from, Jackson or wherever, Jackson, Mississippi? Well, the reason it puzzled them was they all said they never saw any white people. That's how segregated Milwaukee was, this northern city. which proved to be true, of course, all around the country. This wasn't just a Southern problem. We went to Cincinnati, as I said, John and I did, and it took us, took our staff 2 weeks to get a very educated and terribly talented group of young Black men and women to even meet with us. They were not the kind that had been involved in the riots themselves, but they wouldn't even look at us. And they wouldn't shake hands with us, of course. They said, one after another, said they thought they were wasting their time. They said, you're not going to do anything. You two are, and neither are those racists, Lyndon Johnson or Hubert Humphrey. So we're just wasting our time. Well, John and I, we knew about these conditions, and we knew about this kind of alienation already from our backgrounds and experience. But this was really a chilling kind of existence. And later on that same day, in the company of a local poverty worker, a young Black guy, we walked the streets of Cincinnati where the riots had occurred. And we came upon, John and I were both in suits and ties. We came upon a group of about 5 or 6 young Black men, I'd say 25 or under, who were down on their knees shooting craps in daylight on a street corner. As soon as they saw us, they jumped up and came over and they said, "Who are you, the FBI?" And this young poverty worker said, told what we were and who we were. And then when they found out what we were doing, it was just like a chorus. They all were saying, "Jobs, baby, get us a job. We need a job, baby." And one guy said, "Mr. Johnson got me a job last summer, but it ran out." He was talking about President Johnson's summer employment program. And jobs was what we heard over and over and became a really central part of our eventual recommendations. We went back to, with those kinds of experiences, and the same was true of the other members of the commission. Some who'd never seen that kind of hostility and alienation and had not witnessed the terrible poverty that these people were living in, criminally inferior and underfunded schools, no housing or terribly dilapidated housing, no jobs. The jobs had either disappeared, they were disappearing, going overseas or out to the suburbs, and there was no transportation where you could get to those jobs, even if they were available to you. Terrible health care, no health care, awful conditions. And then we met, I got us a room just off the Senate floor in the Capitol, where we met for 44 straight days. Each day we met, our staff, led by Executive Director Dave Ginsburg, would have a draft for us. And we read aloud, he read them aloud. We had it in front of us, that day's draft, as a piece of the report. And he read it aloud. And we voted on, we read and heard and voted on every word in that 400 and something page report. Eventually, we all signed the report, all 11 of us unanimously, but on some tough questions, we had a vote of 6-5. For example, racism. We said these black ghettos, as they were called then, are caused by white racism, and they're sustained by white racism. We said what today we would very much we'd say, geography is destiny. And the geography where black people lived totally segregated everywhere, and the schools were segregated, that was no accident. Well, some of our members hated to say racism. No agency of government that ever said that word. They wanted to say discrimination or intolerance or something. But by a vote of 6-5, we decided to say racism. And we thought that was terribly important, particularly for young Black people, to say, you're not crazy. There is systemic racism in this country. And also we had a 6-5 vote when we said there was no conspiracy behind these riots. President Johnson, unfortunately, distracted and feeling really beleaguered by the Vietnam War and the anti-war protests and so forth, was misinformed. And he thought there was an organization to it. Outside agitators like activists of the day, Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, had somehow caused these. I met with him personally one time at the White House to tell him that's just not true. I said, there are thousands of Stokely Carmichaels and H. Rap Browns that you and I never heard of. And God knows what may happen unless we get at these deeper causes. And so we voted 6-5. People said, well, do we want to say outright that there's no organization here or planning or conspiracy? Well, we don't think so, do we? And yeah, well, we don't. Let's just say so. And eventually, of course, as I said, we all agreed with the final report. David Ginsburg, our executive director, once said, this was the only unanimous report that was adopted by a vote of 6-5.
Fred, you talked about some of the findings a little bit in terms of really inadequate health care, really inadequate housing, the lack of jobs. Any other findings that you'd like to share? And before you answer that, I'd like to read just a quick sentence I think that has been cited over and over again from the report that said that the basic conclusion was that, and I quote now, our nation is moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. Seems like that would probably have resonated as fairly controversial in America in 1967. How was that received then?
Well, it was controversial. A lot of people agreed with it. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, said that our report and our recommendations, which also had to do with the police, I want to mention in a moment, but he said it was a doctor's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. And the great man who was Secretary of Health and Welfare then, John Gardner, said, we are in deep trouble as a people, and history will not deal kindly with any nation which will not tax itself to cure its miseries. Willard Wirtz, who was Secretary of Labor, he capsulized the Kerner report where we said white racism and so forth. He said it's in the words of that great American philosopher Pogo, we have met the enemy and he is us.
Right.
We made a terrible mistake, I think, in this way. And then something else happened too, I want to mention, that caused the problems. We, for example, never thought about having open hearings. Just naturally, all those hearings we had were closed to the press, closed to the public. Nobody thought about it. People did not get to hear what we heard. We never thought to take press with us on these trips out to these riot cities. So it would have been, rather than just hearing or reading our words about what we saw, people would have seen it for themselves. And then a terrible thing happened. we found out soon that we had asked for, well, at first I should say this, we met and decided to ask President Johnson to keep us, our commission, alive for another 6 months so that we could advocate for and lobby for our recommendations. And he rejected that, and as a matter of fact, refused to meet with us. He rejected the report. And we found out that one of the main reasons was he was getting reports all the time from inside the commission, some of the more conservative members, saying that John Lindsay and I were just going crazy and spending a lot of money. I later heard a recording of a telephone conversation he had with Mayor Daley of Chicago. He said, I appointed this commission, and he said they spent $2 million studying, and then they recommended I spend $8 billion to do something about it, and they didn't tell me where I was going to get the money. Well, we know that we learned from an inside staff person in the White House that a member of our commission said to report things to a member of Congress from Texas, who was a close friend of Johnson's. And he said to Johnson, and the staff member used these words, he said, this report is going to ruin you, Lyndon. It has nothing good to say about anything you've done about poverty and racism, which was an absolute lie. Johnson, I might say, that's really sad, because Johnson did more against poverty and racism than any president before or since. And this congressman told him, in addition, he said, they condone and they encourage riots. Well, that's not true. There's a very good book by a guy named Steve Gillen, Dr. Steve Gillen, about the inside workings of the commission, and it came out 2 years ago on the 50th anniversary. And he found all sorts of memos and so forth in the White House. One was from a member of the president's staff to Johnson saying, should we leak this report in order to lessen its impact? And that's exactly what happened. We have put out fearing that there might be some problem with the White House about our report, we made a deal with the Bantam Books. And as we finished each chapter of this report, we gave them that chapter. And so that on the day we were turning it loose, March the 1st, 1968, it would come out in paperback. And it did, and it sold millions and millions of copies. It was a runaway bestseller. So we knew it couldn't be just shelved and rejected. But we also knew that what we needed to do, saying racism, white racism, and the kind of money that we were talking about with that were going to be required for jobs and education and housing and health. We knew that was going to be shocking to a lot of people. So we put it out with an embargo to the media, giving us time to background them, we thought. But we got a call, our executive director did, one night, one evening, and from the Washington Post. They said, we have the report and we're going to release it tomorrow morning. And our man talked to not only Ben Bradley, but also to Catherine Graham, the publisher, tried to talk them out of it. They said, no, we have it legally, and we're going to go with it. And Ginsburg said, well, if you are, you're not going to have an exclusive, we'll turn it loose to everybody. And they said, well, go ahead. And we did, we lifted the embargo. And suddenly, for example, it was just chaos. I got a call, I remember, an AP reporter, Associated Press reporter. He said, I've got a 30-minute deadline. Can you just kind of give me a capsulization of the report? Well, the headlines the next day were like in the Washington Post, white racism cause of black riots, commission says. And they didn't hear the rest of the story. And they didn't hear that what we recommended, as we said, is not just for black people, it's for everybody, rural, urban, black, white, American Indian, and other minorities. My own father, a small farmer in southwestern Oklahoma, he loved me, but the way he heard the report the next day was, Mr. Harris, out of the goodness of your heart, you ought to pay more taxes in order to help poor black people who are rioting in Detroit. And my dad's attitude was, well, to hell with that. I'm already paying too much tax. And what about me? And he was quite right. And we had him in mind, but we didn't get across as much that what we were talking about was good for everybody.
Fred, that's amazing history. And we do have some questions that we're going to get to in just a second. And
yes,
you already touched on what I wanted
to.
I
wanted to say something about the police while we're at it.
Sure, go ahead.
But as I tried to explain to President Johnson, that here's the way these riots, for example, in Detroit, one of the two worst riots and longest lasting, and were finally quelled with the Army. There was an upstairs after hours illegal drinking joint in a crowded black area with high-rise apartments all around. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, two Detroit police people raided it in one squad car. When they got up there, they found that there were about 200 people crowded in there, 200 black people. And so they, one by one, brought them all down to the street and sent for reinforcements and paddy wagons to haul them off. Well, there were the flashing lights. It was a hot July night. Lights went on all over in these high-rise apartments all around. People began to come down to the street to see what was going on. And at first it was a kind of a happy crowd, you know, a lot of them, as I say, had been drinking, with a couple of hundred of them or so. And then somebody threw a Coke bottle that went over one of the spud cars and into the windshield of another and broke the windshield of that squad car. And after that, things just deteriorated and went to hell. And what we found was enormous and justified hostility toward the police in all of these black areas. And often it was the police that were the only part of society that they saw. I spent one night, or better part of a night, for example, in a black precinct in the Bronx, walking around with the district attorney. We didn't have our suits on, and so we sort of melted in. But that precinct house in the Bronx had a sign up in it that said Fort Apache. The police were all white. None of them lived in the neighborhood. And they thought of themselves as a beleaguered Fort Apache. And they came in during the day to enforce the law, not for the community, but against the community. So any random spark could set off these disorders, and we found that that's exactly what had happened.
Yeah. Well, Farah has some questions, and we're going to pick a couple of those right now before we get back to our conversation. Farah?
Yeah, so a couple of the questions are really about the content of the recommendations, which I know we're going to go into. So I'll pose those to you now, Senator. And then another question I just want to put out there, and I know we'll get to it, I'll pose after that. So the questions about the recommendations are, of the Kerner recommendations that were carried out, which ones were the most valuable or would have been the most meaningful? So when you talk through them, to talk about the ones that really had the most value, could have had the most impact. And then the other question that is maybe for down the line a little bit is that if a new commission were appointed today, and I think there's probably a deep level of interest in a comparison since it feels so relevant, even though it's 52 years later. If a new commission were appointed today and tasked with the same charge, do you think the resulting report would be much different? And maybe some reflections on that.
Well, first of all, we don't need any more studies. We know the facts and we know what needs to be done. And the wonderful thing is that what needs to be done is basically what was recommended by the Kerner Commission, and a majority of Americans are in favor of all those things today. Public opinion has greatly changed. And I should say this, that civil rights and anti-poverty programs, so all that was in the air when the commission report came out in March of 1968. And there was a great majority of Democrats in the Congress. And even though Richard Nixon got elected on a law and order, sort of a dog whistle anti-black platform, that took a while to take hold, really. So that we've made progress on virtually every aspect of race and poverty for nearly 10 years after the Kerner report. Take, for example, on desegregation. Soon after the report, and right after the assassination of Dr. King, Walter Mondale had been trying to get a fair housing law passed. But it was subject of a filibuster in the Senate, and he couldn't. It had passed the House. Johnson was for it. But Mondale asked me and Senator Ed Brooks, who was also on the commission, to come and speak about the commission recommendations for a fair housing law. And we broke the filibuster and it passed. And we began to desegregate schools and housing. For example, that lasted until the mid or a little later of 1980s. And the achievement gap, for example, among black kids, between black kids and white kids in the schools was narrowing. And if that rate of narrowing of the achievement gap had continued as it was going, we'd have no such achievement gap today. So we were making a lot of progress. And then in came, among other things, some other things happened too. Jobs disappeared, jobs moved overseas, they were harder to get. And for those young black men, for example, who came to Milwaukee looking for jobs, they got there about the time the jobs weren't any longer around, even if they could have gotten them with all of the discrimination there was. But we made progress until about the time the Reagan administration came in. And then things began to change. And that's when we began to get this increase in inequality of income and wealth in particular. It was already bad enough for black people and brown people. For example, you remember, I had teachers that laughed about this, that after at the end of the Civil War, abolitionists in the North and in Congress set up a Freedmen's Bureau to see that every head of black household, former slave household, had 40 acres and a mule. That sounded funny to my teacher. I gave them 40 acres and a mule. Well, it was they had no property. They had no way to make a living. They had been property. And there also was a very strong proposal for what today we would call federal aid to education. And how much a state would get under that bill was based upon the percentage of poverty. That meant those former slave states were going to get a real substantial chunk of money for education. But before slavery ended, of course, as you know, it was illegal to educate a slave. And so from the very first, what happened then, as you know, the Supreme Court turned their backs on the former slaves, and then the Congress did. And the troops were withdrawn from those Confederate states, and they reverted to type, and black people again became, as the Freedmen's Bureau said in its last report, they became what people considered as their property again, working as sharecroppers and almost like indentured servants. They could be returned, for example, if they left to their employer without paying whatever they owed at the family store and so forth. So that continued, you know, for example, on housing and segregation. You know that after World War II, when we started encouraging housing and set up loan programs, federal loan programs and so forth, that housing was built in areas that had covenants against black people. And so black people didn't get in on that. And the same was true the way the GI Bill was administered. Black people were left out of its implementation. And then the banks redlined districts where poor people and black people lived. And that was more likely, as you know, made illegal. But I've got a friend who was my daughter's, she's African-American, my oldest daughter, Catherine's roommate in college. She later became, Jocelyn did, a college administrator. And then when she retired, she became the head of the museum and the park, which now commemorates that terrible massacre of black people at Greenwood, Oklahoma, which was a part of Tulsa then in 1921. They destroyed what was called Black Wall Street. Well, she was talking to my daughter just within the last few weeks, and she said, retired, she moved back to Tulsa into her parents' old house. It had been a fairly good house, but she said it was run down, and she wanted to get a loan and renovate it. And she could not find a bank who'd lend loan to her. They told her, with your credit history and so forth, you could go anywhere else in Tulsa and we'd loan you the money. We'd be glad to loan you the money, but we can't loan you the money there. She had to take out from her own savings what was necessary to renovate her house. Now that's today. And that's what's happened all along. We prevented black people from having any wealth. And what they had, for example, was a home. And with the Great Recession, as you know, back in 2007 or 2008, so many of those houses were lost. You know, I had let me just say one more thing about what needs to be done. Walter Mondale, I've mentioned once before, he authored a bill, and I co-authored it with him and had hearings on it in my subcommittee, to create a national system of accounting. We have a national system of economic accounting. We get, you know, regular economic reports of what the condition of the economy is, and unemployment and inflation and so forth. And he wanted a parallel organization, and I did too, that would give us a social accounting regularly. We were not able to pass that, but we did eventually get, I think, about a third of the Senate to co-author it. But for example, this, look at now, 70% or more of Americans today say our country's on the wrong track. And if we just, for example, if we had an agency that just reported to us on things like this, life expectancy. Life expectancy in the United States is going down. That's totally unlike what's happening in all the other affluent countries in the world. Or homelessness. Homelessness is a kind of the miner's canary of what's going on in America. So anyway, that some of our recommendations were adopted: fair housing, desegregation of schools and housing. We did not. We brought down the rate of child poverty for a while, but overall poverty, the rate has been stayed about the same, and we've had a great increase in population, and the rate has been stubbornly about the same all the time. And we still, therefore, have millions more people poor than was true in 1968. Black unemployment has stayed, and it is right now, about twice white unemployment, and unemployment for Latinos and for American Indians is as bad or worse.
Thanks for that, Fred. I think it's so interesting to hear how much what the stories that you're telling us, how much they parallel exactly what's happening today. And I think a number of the questions that we're getting from audience members have to do with what kind of policy recommendations might be really influential now. You know, those lessons of the Kerner Commission and from your lifetime in service about what would be most impactful now. But also, I think a number of audience members would also like to hear some of your thoughts on representation. So given the composition of the commission, with 8 white men, 2 black men, and 1 woman, you know, how do you think that impacted results, and what lessons are there in representation of community members and in community member engagement, and kind of what role does identity play and what is implemented?
Well, you know, they Johnson appointed what he thought were fairly safe people, I suppose, except he didn't know me that well. He thought he did. Or John Lindsay, for example, he in that telephone call to Mayor Daley, Lyndon Johnson, I heard recorded that phone call later on. He said, "That son of a bitch, Lindsay." Well, he was the one that appointed John. But he told us, he said, when he gave us our charge, Johnson said, "Let your search be free. Find the truth and express it in your report." And that's what we did. And I said several times, at least 3 times during our discussions and arguments, I quoted Abraham Lincoln at the time of the Civil War. I said, Lincoln said, "In times like the present, no person should utter anything for which he would not willingly be responsible through all time and in eternity." And I think that's, we finally decided, you know, this is going to be history and it's going to be the record, and we better try to tell the truth. Well, tell me back again, the question, Amber.
Well, it's just interesting to hear
it is everything we said, what we found and said then is true today and is needed today. About the police, for example, we thought the police ought to, number one, look like the community where they were supposed to protect and serve, and we thought they ought to be. It ought to be what came to be called community policing system. They ought to be part of the community, and they ought to be enforcing the law on behalf of the community rather than against the community. And we were very much against what came to be the terrible militarization of the police, where we had all these military weapons and vehicles and tanks and so forth. We think we don't need more militarization. And for example, at Portland or at the White House, when the president walked over to that church with the Bible, we don't need a national police. We've always been opposed to a national police force. The FBI is not a police force, it's an investigative force. We've always thought that the 10th Amendment rules here, that we never gave the power to the national government to have a police force. That was a state and local responsibility, and we ought to keep it that way. And we particularly don't need one secret police that comes and dresses up in military garb, camouflage garb, and military instruments and weapons and so forth. At any rate, the International Association of the Chiefs of Police adopted our report in regard to the police, and we made some progress on that for a while. And then, primarily for budgetary reasons, I think, people began to say, well, we really can't do that. And then the federal government was offering all this military stuff for low price or free. And they said, well, we ought to back that tank or those military rifles and so forth. And then and so that all changed. And then I think that we gave to the police, in a sense, a lot of things that they just ought not to have to be responsible for. For example, if you have some kind of a kid acting out in school, that's not a police matter. You ought not to send armed police into the schools, as we've done in a lot of places. Or you take a situation like we had here in Albuquerque. You remember that poor fellow with known mental health problems that was camping up there on the edge of the mountains, and they sent a SWAT team up there to get that guy out or do something with him, and they wound up killing him, shooting him. Or here lately, not too long ago, it's within 4 or 5 months, there was a woman here in Albuquerque called the police and said, my son, who has emotional problems, is having a crisis, and he's locked himself in the bathroom with a knife. It's a pocket knife, and we're afraid he's going to hurt himself. And could you come out and do something? They went out there, and he came out, they said, menacing them with this knife, a pocket knife, and they shot him in the head. That's a problem for mental health experts who ought to be there or with the police. And the same is true about in the schools, or, for example, domestic relations. We need experts in how to, and they know how to de-escalate these kinds of situations. But we put this gradually, you and I haven't, but somebody has, on to the police. And so I think it's a really great thing that's happened with this terrible, as a result of the killing of Floyd George and these other killings by the police, which have gone unpunished. All of us are sick at heart, grief-stricken, mad as hell. And I think that's tragically, that has caused a shift in public opinion. When we came to the Kerner report, there were polls that showed that if you ask white people and black people the same question, do you think that black people are mistreated and discriminated against and so forth? Black people, 99% said yes. White people, a majority said they didn't think so. I think a lot of people say, well, we passed these civil rights laws and everything's all taken care of now, and the anti-poverty programs and so forth. But that's all changed now. And the great majority of people say the Floyd George killing, that was not just a one-time thing, or any of the others, that this is systemic. And I think people are ready, there's no question about it, to do something about it. and I think we've got a great chance. So I was just going to say this. Two things that I think America needs. One is some radical optimism like Franklin Roosevelt had. Franklin Roosevelt, we came out of that Great Depression, and he was optimistic. He knew, he didn't know exactly what to do in those days, but he knew to do something. And that was true even of Harry Truman and even of Dwight Eisenhower. For example, we came out of World War II, another crisis period, we came out of the Great Depression, out of World War II, we had a national debt of 140% of gross domestic product. And people say, oh my gosh, we've got to do something, you know, we've got cut programs or whatever. But Harry Truman said, no, we're going to have the GI Bill. We're going to send these people to school, and we're going to give them a good education so they can get good jobs. And we're going to have, get them housing. We're going to subsidize loans and guarantee loans so that they can get houses and so forth. And Eisenhower, for example, he said, we're going to build the greatest public works program since the days of Rome, the interstate highway system. And the federal government's going to pay 90% of the cost. States just have to pick up 10% to do that. Well, just as with the GI Bill, what an enormous boost this was, and a permanent boost to the economy. And here today, you know, we've got the majority leader in the US Senate, Senator McConnell, who said yesterday, just yesterday, I've got 20 members of my caucus who say we've spent enough. We can't run up any more deficit. We can't spend any more money. 20 of his members. Well, what we need, I think, is we need the kind of optimism, radical optimism, maybe you call it, somebody called it that, and to say, you know, it's a myth that there's a scarcity. We're not broke. We have plenty of money, and we can print money, and people don't have any trouble with deficits and debts. I mean, some more conservatives don't. If it's to lower taxes for the rich and the big corporations, or to spend more money on the military, well, I think housing ought to be a human right. And health is, I think, a human right. And a job, people ought to be a right. For example, Franklin Roosevelt, he instituted the CCC program, Civilian Conservation Corps. My Uncle Jack, I remember this. And my Uncle Jack joined up the CCCs. You know, no work in Walters then. This in the 30s. They sent him out here to New Mexico, where he worked on a reforestation program, planting trees. My dad, who was a day laborer, a farmer without a farm, he got a job with the WPA, the Work Progress Administration, building the Walters Courthouse. Well, we gave jobs to people, even the jobs that government created. Right now, we could create enormous numbers of jobs with investments in infrastructure. We need it. You know, I don't know how many of our audience have traveled around the world. I've been all over the world and many other places. My youngest daughter, when she was just 14, went with a friend up to Montana to the Crow Indian Fair. And she attended the Crow Indian Rodeo. And she came home and she was telling me that the announcer, the Crow Indian guy, started off by saying, ladies and gentlemen, and all you white people, he said, we have cowboys here tonight from all over the world and many other places. Well, I've been all over the world and many other places. And when I come home, I think we look like a third world country. You go to these other countries, you see brand new, wonderful airports, great super highways, fast trains on continuously welded tracks, high speed railroads, and what have we got? None of that. Our school buildings are falling apart. Our infrastructure is falling apart. There's a great many jobs. People need childcare. There ought to be universal health care. There ought to be universal childcare, for example, so people can work. You know, people think, well, my gosh, you know, you bring in these immigrants or doing all this for blacks. What we've got to realize is, and this is the other thing I think we need radical optimism. And we need what I call communitization. We need to realize that we ought to be a community. We've got common problems. And studies clearly show, for example, that when women began to enter the workforce, what that did was give our economy a tremendous boost. And the same was true back when we began to try to do away with discrimination against black people. As more of them entered the workforce and began better earnings and so forth, the economy got better. It was good for all of us. We're all in this thing together, and that's why I always say everybody does better when everybody does better. And we need to. There's a role for the civic part of our society too, I think. I reminded your mother-in-law, Margaret Gover, and my former wife, Madonna Harris, started back in the 50s. This is before the civil rights laws. I think it started out informally. I was in the meantime, I was doing the public stuff. The mayor had appointed me to a commission to integrate the restaurants in Lawton, and we made quite a bit of progress until one day we had all the restaurant owners up in the city council office, and you know, because they were saying, well, you know, I don't want to be the first one to admit that blacks into my restaurant because, you know, it hurt business. But if everybody did it, so we thought we had everybody ready to go. And one woman who had the most popular, got a down-home restaurant, a greasy spoon, really. She got up to talk, and I thought, oh, right. If she says she's ready to integrate, that does it. And she said, well, what I don't understand is if we don't want to eat with the colored, why do the colored want to eat with us? And that broke the whole thing up for the moment. Later, we made some more progress. But what Margaret Gover and LaDonna and others, and I had a little part in it, did was they decided, let's, we knew some black people in Lawton that were our friends. And we knew that, for example, they had to sit in the balcony in theaters, and they couldn't get jobs in any of the downtown stores, and they couldn't eat in the restaurants and so forth. And so the idea was, let's have a group of black families and a group of white families meet once a week. 1 week could be in the home of a black family, the next week in the home of a white family. Just socialize that. They were thinking, wait, let's just get to know each other better. And so they'd have a cocktail or two, and then they'd eat. It was a potluck generally. And then the first thing you know, they begin to say, well, wait a minute, you know, J.C. Penney's won't hire any black people. We were lucky that next door to Lawton was Fort Sill military, Army reservation, and the commandant was a person who believed in integration and equality. So they could get him to put this business off limits if it discriminated. And they began to integrate the businesses in Lawton, starting with just that informal group. And as a matter of fact, their name, they just called themselves the group. And that was back in the 50s. I think that there's something to that. Every organization, I think one of the most marvelous things about Voices for, the New Mexico Voices for Children is how integrated it is in its board, how diversified it is in its board. I think we might not be able to set up a group everywhere, but I think we can do what our governor's done, set up a commission, a racial commission, a reconciliation commission, whatever you want to call it. And also Mayor Tim Keller of Albuquerque has begun to do that as well. We can at least, on every organization we're in, it ought to give us a chance to see people that are not exactly like us, brown people, black people, and others. And I think as we do that, we can begin to see we have a common interest. So when I say we've got to communitize, that's partly what I mean, but I also mean this. I think one of the great people of America today is Reverend William Barber of North Carolina. He's been, as we all know, here. He spoke to voices once, and the most inspirational I ever heard until I heard him speak to the Democratic National Committee a year ago in California, where he just electrified that crowd. He says this: we can't keep each of us, blacks, whites, Latinos, LGBTQ plus, rural, urban. We can't be fighting all in our separate silos. Labor over here, civil rights over here. We've got to make our enemies fight all of us at once. And I think that's exactly true. And that's what I mean by communitizing. That's part of what I mean by that. So I think we need radical optimism. And that means people have to have an income. The best way to get an income is with a job. And there are plenty of jobs that need doing. And if we run out of anything else to do, we ought to do like Franklin Roosevelt did and provide jobs. We ought to invest in alternative energy. There are millions of jobs in that, in childcare, in healthcare. We ought to increase the earned income allowance for people that are working as hard as they can work. We ought to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. And we ought to see that people have homes. You know, if you say, well, why are there so many homeless? Well, one thing is they don't have any homes. And I know it's more complicated than that, more complicated than it was in Franklin Roosevelt's day. But here's what we know for sure, that if rents go up an average of $100 a month, you will increase homelessness by 15%. And so people have got to have incomes. There is a program already for subsidy for people for homes, for rent or for ownership. But that rental program, that subsidy program, has a cap on it, and it only spends 19 billion. If you added just 41 billion, which is really a small amount of money compared to the trillions that we spend, if you added 41 billion to that program, we would make homelessness in this country, that alone would make homelessness in this country rare, temporary, and non-recurring. I think we've got to be optimistic because we know what works and people are ready for it to work. It's up to us.
Fred, you just nailed a couple of questions we were getting about how disheartening it might seem to be for some people that have, where you talk about some things haven't changed all that much in over 50 years, but you really directly hit upon, you know, what it is that we need. We need that radical optimism. But I want to ask you, we're almost out of time here, but one question I want to get to before we end is sort of the political will, right? We've seen what can happen when there is a political will. And if we just look at New Mexico, you know, David Abbey, the director of the Legislative Finance Committee, talked about the lost decade that occurred during the Martinez administration. And by that, he meant that if you look at almost any indicator, we did worse over a decade because we adopted this scarcity mentality that you referenced. And, you know, my question is, we need to use the political system to get the right people elected. And in my mind, to a large degree, that means electing more women to office. But what would you say to people who may feel a little disenchanted or disheartened by the political system?
Well, let me just say about the women. When I went to the Oklahoma State Senate, there was not a single woman in either the House or the Senate, not one. When I started practicing law, there was a constitutional provision which prohibited women serving on juries. You had these old dingy courthouses, spittoons here and there, no women's restrooms. When I went to the United States Senate, there were only 2 women in the United States Senate. I can tell you that it makes a huge difference. It did with juries. It did when they became members of the Oklahoma legislature. And it's true here in New Mexico and at the national level as well. So that's certainly number one. And here we ought to pay our legislators so that only those who can afford it would not be the only ones to serve. But there is the people are now ready. You know, I don't know, they weren't quite ready to hear what we had to say. Every 10 years since the Kerner Commission, I have updated, been a part of updating the Kerner Commission, trying to get race and poverty back on the national agenda. The people are now ready to hear it. I think we could have done a better job, as I said, if we'd had the press with us and so forth during our work. But now they're ready. There's more activism today than I've ever seen. But just think of, and I've talked about this radical optimism again. Dr. Martin Luther King had it, and so did John Lewis, who I used to say was a living saint, and I still say is an American saint. Look what they were up against. Jim Crow was not just a practice, it was a law in this country. And they persevered, and they were successful. They made enormous changes in the law, and some practice changes as well, though we need a great deal more. Now, look what's happened. We've got, it started with the Women's March, I think, the day after the inauguration of the present president. And a lot of people say, well, that's great, but that'll die out. It hasn't, it's grown. And we've got organizations that fell out of that like Indivisible. And we've got the Women's March for I'm thinking about whatever the anti-guns thing that your wife, Alexis, has been very active in. And then there was the Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter used to be thought of as a fringe group by a lot of people. But today, a great majority of Americans support Black Lives Matter. So the people are ready to hear these things. And what we've got to do, first of all, is vote. My wife, Margaret Elliston, is doing the Lord's work. She is the state chair of the Democratic Party. She called me her chief of staff. So we've got to, as I said, we're not only grief-stricken and sick at heart, but mad as hell with all of these police killings of black men like like Floyd George. We've got to stay mad as hell, at least through November, and change our government. And when we change our government, we know right now what needs to be done.
Fred, thank you so much. And to our audience, sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. We probably could have talked easily for 2 or 3 more hours, but if you like what you heard, I encourage you to think about supporting the work of New Mexico Voices for Children. There's in the chat box, you'll find a link to a donation page that can support our work. It's so important that we have the support of the community to continue to do this kind of work. We would like to hear your reactions. Please send us an email about what you liked and even what you didn't like. And we'll do even better next time. I think this is a conversation with Fred that we would like to continue on some other topics. And with that, Amber, thank you so much.
Can I just add a word, Amber?
Certainly.
And James, thank you all so much for the wonderful work you do at Voices. You know, people always say, well, what can I do? I think that one thing you can answer is like Cory Booker says, do something. All of us can do something. You know, maybe at ACLU, you're interested in that, or Planned Parenthood, or I hope in New Mexico Voices, which I know is the most influential progressive group in New Mexico. We can all do something, and supporting New Mexico Voices is one key way, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred,
Amber?
so much for joining us, and thanks to all of our audience members. We really appreciate you, and Fred, we appreciate you, and we hope you all have a great evening. Thanks again.